Last night, Super Tuesday, primary voting in 14 states. In some places, voters only took a few minutes to vote, but other places, especially in Texas and California, voters experienced extremely long lines.
Thousands of us, and we've been sitting out here for 5 hours.
I'd say there was probably like maybe 100, 150 people, and it took us about 2 hours.
In both places, it's different from traditional precinct voting, and it's what's called a vote center model. And the main thing about a vote center model is that instead of having lots of individual little neighborhood precincts where people vote, you have kind of voting supercenters where anybody in the location can vote on that day. They can choose, but they reduce the number of precinct polling places in favor of having these supercenters.
So the voting supercenter is supposed to be more convenient for more voters, but what can actually go wrong if it's not implemented the right way?
When they maybe consolidate their locations and when they reduce precincts, they need to pay attention to traffic from previous years, but they don't really know for sure just how many people might show up at a new location, for example.
How could voting take just a few minutes in one state and hours in another?
Every state can actually do it differently. They'll have different equipment. Some places may use hand-marked paper ballots. Some places may be mostly by mail, and other places will use a lot of equipment.
For anyone who tried to cast a ballot last night, are we sure that their votes are going to be counted, tabulated in their vote count?
For anybody that stayed and didn't walk away in frustration, yes, your ballots will be counted, and it really does matter. And it was gratifying, it's painful, but we heard from a lot of voters that said, I waited in line for hours because that's how important voting is to me.
What needs to be top of mind for voters? What should they be asking their local county clerks, registers, election officials before November?
Can I vote early? Can I vote before Election Day? Do I have choices for how many different locations I go to? If I need to vote an absentee ballot by mail, how early do I need to do that? All of those are things that can relieve pressure from having a crush of people going to in-person places on Election Day.
Did we have any word from our federal agencies and intelligence partners of any kind of cyber attacks, ransomware, malicious interference last night?
The reports from the Department of Homeland Security or from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, their reports were that what they were seeing was typical sort of low-level activity, but they were not aware of any concerted meddling or attacks or anything like that.
After 2016 Russian interference, there was a rush to make sure this never happens again. What are the challenges for administrators, and is the solution always a new machine?
It may not always be a new machine, and there's no doubt that a big technology refresh has been contributing to change since 2016. The key for all of those election officials is to start that process early, communicate with your voters, let them know what's going on, and if things are going to change, where do they need to go vote? What are all their choices? What
is the safest and best election technology for voters?
The safest and best election technology for voters is a hand-marked paper ballot or a paper ballot in a traditional format for voters that need assistive technology if they have a disability.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.